Stray cat enters church during sermon. The miracle that followed will shock you. Father James Mitchell stood at the pulpit, his voice low and steady as it filled the quiet church. His homily had begun, but the heat and the serenity of the place seemed to slow time itself. The only sounds were the rustling of hymnals, the occasional cough, and the soft shuffle of feet as parishioners settled in for what would be an hour of reflection. His voice rang out once again.
Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.
His words, drawn from the Gospel of Matthew, echoed through the ancient walls, calling attention to the importance of service, compassion, and the often overlooked value of caring for those in need. He paused, allowing the scripture to settle in the hearts of the congregation, a quiet invitation to reflect on how they could embody these teachings in their daily lives. In the third row, near the middle aisle, sat 10-year-old Esther Cooper. Her small frame was slouched slightly as she clutched the hymnal in her lap, but her eyes were fixed ahead, her gaze distant. Esther's hair, the color of autumn chestnuts, framed her pale face. Her expression was unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no sign of the lively, chatty girl she once was. For 2 years since her father had left without a word, Esther had not spoken. Her mother Ellen sat beside her, her eyes often flicking to Esther with a quiet worry that had become a constant companion. Esther's silence had been a source of deep concern for Ellen. She had taken her to therapists and specialists, hoping for a breakthrough, but no one seemed to understand why Esther had locked herself away in a world of silence. The therapist called it selective mutism, a response to trauma, but Ellen knew it was more than that. Esther had once been the bubbly girl who laughed at the dinner table, who sang along to her favorite songs. But when her father walked out the door, leaving only an empty house and a trail of unanswered questions, Esther's world had become mute. The echo of her father's departure still lingered in the space between them, a constant ache in her heart. Ellen tried everything she could think of, trying to coax Esther into speaking, reassuring her, offering gentle encouragement. But Esther's eyes often stayed downcast, her lips locked. Each day felt like a step further away from the girl she had known. Father Mitchell's voice reverberated through the quiet church as he continued his sermon. He spoke with conviction, his words drawing from his own deep well of faith and experience.
In this world we often look for grand gestures of faith,
He said.
We long for miracles, healings, divine visions, and dramatic signs from above. But my brothers and sisters, we must remember that sometimes the greatest miracles come in the smallest, humblest forms.
As he spoke, his eyes swept over the congregation, pausing briefly on Esther and her mother. He had seen the grief in their eyes before, and knew the pain they carried. His voice softened, as though speaking directly to them.
Matthew 25:40 reminds us that whatever we do for the least of these, we do for Christ himself. It's not always the obvious or the loud that serves God's will. Often it is the quiet, the unnoticed, and the humble acts of kindness that reveal his presence.
Father Mitchell paused, allowing his words to settle into the hearts of those listening. The church was so still, the heat almost thick in the air, and yet there was something in the moment that felt like it held its breath.
As we gather here today,
He continued,
let us remember that we are called to serve those who are forgotten, those who are ignored, and those who are in need, whether it's through a kind word, a hand reached out, or a simple act of compassion.
He looked down at the scripture in his hand, the weight of the words grounding him as he prepared to go on.
But we also must remember that miracles are not always dramatic. Sometimes God's hand moves in the quietest of ways. Sometimes a soft word, a kind touch, or even a simple gesture can be the spark of something greater.
As he spoke these words, he glanced around the room once more, feeling the pulse of the congregation as they silently absorbed his message. It was in these quiet moments of reflection, he thought, that God often worked the most. And in that stillness, he had faith that the congregation was about to experience something unexpected, something that would remind them of the power of simple acts of kindness and the profound impact they could have. As Father Mitchell continued with his sermon, the atmosphere in the church seemed to settle into a calm rhythm. the only sounds being his steady voice and the occasional cough or shuffle from the congregation. The heat of the late summer morning seemed to intensify the stillness, creating an almost stifling air inside the old stone church. But then, just as Father Mitchell made a pause to let his words sink in, an unexpected sound broke the quiet, a soft, scratching noise at the wooden door at the back of the church. The congregation turned in surprise as the door slowly creaked open. At first, no one could see what had caused the disturbance, but then a scraggly orange tabby cat, thin and ragged, cautiously stepped over the threshold. Its ribs were clearly visible through its matted fur, and it moved with the kind of slow, deliberate steps that spoke of both weariness and uncertainty. The cat seemed to be searching for something, maybe comfort, maybe safety, or perhaps simply a place to rest. It didn't hesitate to make its way deeper into the church, its eyes scanning the room as though it could sense the weight of the many gazes upon it. A mild stir rippled through the congregation, people exchanging confused looks and murmurs. Mrs. Henderson, the choir director, pursed her lips tightly, a clear frown creasing her forehead. She didn't even try to hide her disapproval. She shifted in her seat, making a slight noise of irritation, as though the cat's intrusion was a personal affront to the sanctity of the service.
That's just what we need.
She muttered under her breath, loud enough for a few of the women seated nearby to hear.
A stray cat in the middle of Mass. Doesn't Father Mitchell have control over the doors?
Others around her muttered their own discontent, though in softer tones. Some shook their heads while others simply frowned in confusion. The cat's arrival was a disruption, and it seemed that no one quite knew what to do with this uninvited guest. Yet the cat moved forward undeterred, its head held high despite its obvious frailty, as if it had a purpose beyond the small church's walls. The orange tabby continued its journey down the center aisle, its steps slow but steady, one paw at a time. With each step, it moved further into the church, cutting through the rows of pews. The high wooden beams above seemed to frame its passage as though the church itself was acknowledging its presence, even if the humans inside did not. The cat's movements were calm and purposeful, a quiet procession that contrasted sharply with the murmurs and uneasy glances that followed it. As it padded down the aisle, it seemed oblivious to the disapproving stares and the unspoken judgments of the congregation. The cat didn't seem to care about the murmurs or the awkward glances from those who were uncomfortable with its presence. It was on a mission, perhaps to find warmth, perhaps to find solace, but certainly not to be deterred by the human opinions surrounding it. It was a movement of innocence and humility, an unspoken declaration that this small creature, weak and malnourished, had no intentions of causing trouble. It walked as if it knew its place, not as an intruder, but as an unexpected guest, one who had found its way into a house of faith without being invited. The cat's journey seemed to echo the humility that Father Mitchell had just spoken of in his sermon, the willingness to serve, to enter into the unknown with open eyes and a trusting heart. As the cat neared the altar, the quiet of the church seemed to deepen, as if everyone collectively held their breath. There was something about the cat's quiet perseverance that made even the most hardened parishioners pause, if only for a moment. It was as though its presence had brought the entire congregation into a shared experience, a moment of reflection on their own responses to the unexpected, to the unknown. The congregation's reaction, on the other hand, was far less harmonious. Some shifted uncomfortably in their pews, unsure how to respond to the cat's presence. Others kept their eyes trained on the animal, watching with a mix of confusion and curiosity. The younger children, sensing something special in the moment, giggled softly, whispering to each other as they pointed at the scruffy cat. And yet it was clear that the cat was not welcomed by everyone. Mrs. Henderson had now crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her disapproval obvious. She shot Father Mitchell a questioning look, as if to say, "Are you going to let this go on?" But Father Mitchell, caught in his own thoughts, had not yet noticed the disruption. His focus remained on the scripture and the message he was delivering, oblivious to the scene unfolding before him. In the third row, Esther Cooper watched the cat with a sense of wonder that seemed to draw her out of the silence she had lived in for the past 2 years. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt something stir within her. The presence of the cat, small and vulnerable, was an unexpected but welcome distraction. It was almost as though the cat itself was a tiny miracle, a moment of grace in the midst of her stillness. Esther hadn't spoken a word since her father left. The silence had become a prison, one that she felt trapped in every day. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of connection, the distance that had grown between her and the world. Her mother had tried everything to help her find her voice again, but nothing seemed to break the wall that Esther had built around herself. Therapy had offered little relief, and her mother's quiet desperation only made Esther retreat further into herself. But now, as she watched the cat move down the aisle, something in her heart began to shift. It wasn't just the cat's innocent presence that caught her attention. It was the way it moved, how it seemed so sure of its path, despite its weakness. The cat's vulnerability reminded Esther of her own, her quiet, unseen pain, her longing to be understood. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap, twitched slightly, and before she fully realized what she was doing, Esther found herself slowly sliding out of her seat. The movements felt almost foreign to her, as if her body was reacting before her mind could process what was happening. But there she was, inching down toward the aisle, her eyes never leaving the cat. The soft sound of the cat's purring reached her ears, and it was like a balm to her soul. She hadn't heard a sound like that in what felt like ages, and the simple, gentle rhythm of it seemed to stir something deep within her. Without thinking, Esther extended her hand toward the cat. She didn't speak, but her fingers trembled slightly as they reached out, guided by a deep, instinctual connection to the small creature. The moment was fragile, tender, and filled with an emotion that Esther hadn't experienced in so long, a desire to reach out, to connect, to let go of the silence that had imprisoned her. Her mother, seated beside her, noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye and gasped softly. She watched in disbelief as her daughter, for the first time in 2 years, reached out towards something, not just anything, but something that had the power to break the silence that had stolen her voice. Tears welled up in Ellen's eyes as she saw the tentative but genuine gesture. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Her daughter, who had been trapped in silence, was now reaching out. She was reaching out to the cat, but in doing so, she was reaching out to the world once more. The cat, with its ragged fur and hungry eyes, had unknowingly become a bridge, a path back to the life Esther had once known. As Esther's hand hovered just above the cat's fur, she whispered, her voice soft and cracked.
"Here, kitty."
The words were shaky, rough with the dust of years of silence. But they were words. Words that carried more weight than Esther could fully understand at that moment. It was the beginning of something, the first step toward a connection she thought she had lost forever. The cat, as if sensing the significance of the moment, looked up at Esther with golden eyes. It seemed to pause, almost as if waiting for something. Then slowly it leaned into Esther's outstretched hand, allowing her to gently stroke its head. The congregation fell silent, as if holding their breath, witnessing a miracle in real time. The sound was fragile, hesitant, but undeniably real. The words were a gift, unexpected, unbidden, yet profoundly significant. Her voice, still raw from the silence of 2 long years, trembled with the weight of unspoken emotions, each syllable breaking through the barricade of grief and isolation that had held her captive. The voice that had been stilled for so long now fluttered into existence like a fragile bird taking its first flight. In that moment, Esther's mother, Ellen, felt her breath catch in her chest. She had grown so accustomed to the quiet absence of Esther's voice that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to hear it. When Esther spoke, Ellen could feel the room shift, her heart thudding loudly in her chest as a wave of disbelief swept over her. The sound of her daughter's voice, so simple, yet so powerful, seemed to fill every corner of the church, seeping into the very air they breathed. Ellen gasped, a soft, broken sound, and tears immediately welled up in her eyes. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at Esther, her hands trembling as they rested in her lap. The miracle was unfolding before her very eyes. For 2 years, Ellen had watched her daughter withdraw into herself, the light in her eyes dimming with each passing day. She had tried everything: therapy, new schools, trying to coax Esther out of her shell, but nothing had worked. The silence had been their constant companion, and it had grown into a heavy weight neither of them could escape. And now, in this sacred moment, in the midst of the church, Esther had found her voice again. As the words left Esther's mouth, a hush fell over the congregation. They had all been watching, silently observing the exchange between the young girl and the cat, unsure of what to make of the strange yet touching scene that was unfolding. But now, with Esther's first words in 2 years, they were suddenly aware that something far greater was happening than they had realized. Ellen, still unable to believe her ears, reached out instinctively, her hand resting on Esther's shoulder. She leaned close, her voice breaking as she whispered,
Esther, you spoke. You spoke, baby.
Esther turned to her mother, her eyes wide with confusion and wonder, unsure of how to process what had just happened. But then, as the shock of the moment faded, a small, tentative smile played at the corners of her lips. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a smile filled with relief, with the faintest flicker of hope that had long been absent. The cat, now comfortably curled in Esther's lap, purred softly, its rhythmic sound creating a soothing undercurrent to the overwhelming emotions in the room. The sensation of the cat's warm body against Esther's was comforting, grounding her in a reality she had not dared to believe could exist. The miracle wasn't just in the cat's unexpected arrival, it was in the healing that had begun, the brokenness that was slowly starting to mend. The church was still, and the air felt thick with emotion. The suddenness of Esther's words left the congregation in a state of stunned silence. The quiet that followed was not one of discomfort, but of awe, as though the very air had changed. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. It was as if time itself had paused to honor the significance of this moment. For the elderly woman sitting in the pew to Esther's right, tears silently rolled down her cheeks. She had been attending this church for decades, yet she had never witnessed anything like this. She had heard many sermons, had seen many baptisms, but nothing could compare to the raw, unspoken miracle she had just witnessed. A small child, silenced by grief, had found her voice, and in that voice, the entire congregation could hear the echoes of God's grace. The woman clutched her prayer book to her chest, her eyes fixed on Esther and the cat. She whispered to herself,
Thank you, Lord. Thank you for this gift.
Several other parishioners followed suit, murmuring prayers of gratitude under their breath, unsure of how to express what they were feeling. There was a sense of reverence, a deep respect for the moment that was unfolding before them. For some, it felt like they had just been witness to a small, personal miracle, something that could never be explained, only felt. In the back, the children, who had been fidgeting earlier in the service, suddenly grew still, their eyes wide as they watched Esther with wide-eyed wonder. A few of them whispered to one another, asking questions they didn't quite know how to articulate. Why did the cat come? Why did Esther speak? What does it all mean? But no one had an answer. All they had were feelings, a deep sense of awe, a connection to something greater than themselves, and a reminder that miracles could happen in the most unexpected of places. And then there was Mrs. Henderson. Her disapproving frown had slowly softened, her rigid posture now relaxed as she watched the scene unfold. She had been the first to voice her discomfort at the cat's arrival, but now seeing Esther speak, seeing the young girl reach out in this miraculous way, something shifted in her heart. The hardness that had colored her gaze seemed to melt, replaced by a flicker of understanding. The moment was more than just a cat in the church. It was a sign of healing, of faith, and of the unexpected ways in which God works. Father Mitchell, who had been pacing back and forth at the altar, suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the congregation. He had been speaking about faith, about the ways in which miracles could unfold in the most unexpected ways. But even he had not anticipated the miracle that was happening right before his eyes. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. There in the front pew sat Esther, her hands resting gently on the cat as it curled contentedly in her lap. Her face, once marked by sorrow and silence, was now alive with something new, something akin to peace. The cat, for all its raggedness and weariness, seemed to exude an energy that radiated warmth and calm. Its purring was a sound of comfort, of healing, of grace. Father Mitchell felt the weight of the moment, the depth of the emotion that filled the room. He knew he could not continue his sermon in the same way. This was not just a moment to be talked about. It was a moment to be lived. He could see the miracle in front of him, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself humbled by it. He cleared his throat, his voice now softer, more reverent.
My friends,
He said, pausing for a moment to gather his thoughts.
we have witnessed a miracle today. We have seen a young girl find her voice after a long silence, and in that voice, we have heard the echoes of God's love.
The words were simple, but the weight of them settled over the congregation like a gentle rain. Father Mitchell turned his gaze toward Esther, his heart filled with gratitude and awe.
Sometimes,
He continued,
the miracles we seek are not grand or loud. They are small, quiet, and personal. And today, we have seen one of those miracles unfold before us.
Tears welled up in his eyes as he spoke, his voice breaking slightly with the raw emotion of the moment.
Let us give thanks
He said,
for the miracle of faith, for the miracle of healing, and for the love that surrounds us all.
The congregation, still in awe, joined him in prayer. Their hearts were full, not just of thanks, but of wonder. This was a moment they would never forget, a reminder that even in the midst of silence and sorrow, there was the potential for healing, for new beginnings, and for the unexpected ways in which God's grace could touch their lives. As the hush of the congregation lingered in the air, Father Mitchell stood still at the altar, his sermon notes forgotten in his hands. The profound silence that had descended upon the church was unlike any he had ever felt before. For a moment he simply breathed, taking in the weight of what had just transpired. Esther's voice, her long-awaited words, had been a gift, not just to her mother, not just to herself, but to everyone present in that room. And it wasn't just her voice, it was the cat, the unexpected vessel of this miracle, which had brought them all to this sacred moment. Father Mitchell's fingers clenched around his notes, but he didn't need them anymore. The scripture he had been reading from Matthew 25:40 was still fresh in his mind, but it felt almost secondary now. The words from that passage, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me," seemed to come alive in an entirely new way. The cat, small, scraggly, and seemingly insignificant, had become a messenger of God's love. It was a living testament to the truth that God's miracles didn't come wrapped in grand gestures or fanfare. Sometimes they arrived in the quietest, humblest forms. With a deep breath, Father Mitchell began to speak, his voice quieter now, but still filled with authority.
My dear friends,
He began, his eyes scanning the congregation.
today we've witnessed something truly extraordinary. A miracle, yes, but not in the way we might have expected.
He paused, allowing the words to sink in, watching as the congregation leaned forward, eager to hear him speak more.
The miracle before us,
He continued,
wasn't something grand or spectacular. It didn't come in the form of fire from the sky or the parting of seas. It didn't come with fanfare or trumpets announcing its arrival. No, this miracle came through the most unlikely of vessels, a cat.
He allowed a small, knowing smile to touch his lips as he looked toward the orange tabby still resting in Esther's lap.
A cat, malnourished and stray, whose presence disrupted our routine, but whose quiet purring has brought peace to this place.
Father Mitchell paused again, his eyes softening as he looked down at Esther.
We all know the story of the shepherd leaving the 99 to find the one lost sheep. In this moment, we've seen that God doesn't forget the lost, the broken, or the forgotten. He brings hope through the smallest and most humble of vessels in ways we might never expect.
He took a deep breath, letting the truth of the moment wash over him.
And it is not in the grandness of things that we find God, but in the quiet, the unexpected, the gentle nudges that stir our hearts. Esther's voice, which has been silent for so long, is the echo of God's love reaching out. But it didn't come in the form we thought it would. It came through the simple, unremarkable presence of a cat, a creature that needed to be loved and cared for, just like all of us.
Father Mitchell's voice softened, his words now more reflective.
The greatest miracles are not those that stun us with their grandeur, but those that remind us to see the beauty in the quiet moments. The love that heals the heart doesn't always come with a loud proclamation. Sometimes it comes through the smallest of creatures in the simplest of acts. And sometimes it takes a moment like this, a moment of vulnerability, to remind us that God's grace is always present, even when we least expect it.
The congregation sat in awe, listening as Father Mitchell spoke. His words, simple yet powerful, resonated deeply with each person in the room. The quiet miracle of Esther's first words, the cat's arrival, and the profound emotional breakthrough that had followed. It all seemed to fit into a larger, more mysterious plan. The message was clear. God's miracles were not about power or spectacle, but about faith in the small, humble things and trust in the power of love. As Father Mitchell finished speaking, the room remained still. The weight of the moment settled deeply in the hearts of everyone present. The congregation, who had initially been confused by the cat's sudden entrance, now saw it in a new light. It was no longer a simple distraction or disruption. It had become a vessel for God's presence, a reminder of how even the smallest things can carry the deepest of meanings. A few members exchanged glances across the pews, and in those brief, silent looks, a collective understanding passed between them. It was as if the cat had opened a door into a new way of seeing, of believing, and of understanding God's work in the world. They had all witnessed something extraordinary today, but it wasn't just about Esther finding her voice or the cat's unexpected arrival. It was about the quiet, subtle ways in which God worked in their lives every day. A middle-aged woman, seated near the front, caught the eye of her neighbor and gave a slight nod, her lips pressed together in acknowledgement. For years she had been struggling with the loss of her own child, and the silence she had lived with mirrored Esther's. She had come to church today seeking comfort, and while she had never expected to find a miracle, there it was, right in front of her. It wasn't loud or brash, it was gentle, like the soft purring of the cat in Esther's lap. It was a reminder that even in moments of deep pain, God was still at work, bringing healing in ways they couldn't always understand. A man in the back pew, who had been quietly struggling with his faith, looked around at the faces of those sitting near him. He had spent many years questioning the existence of miracles, but what he had witnessed today was undeniable. The return of Esther's voice, the miraculous timing of the cat's entrance, and the emotional weight of the moment, it all left him with a deep, abiding sense of wonder. For the first time in a long while, he found himself believing in something greater than himself. He wasn't sure exactly what it all meant, but he knew one thing. God was present in this room. Ellen sat beside Esther, her hands trembling as she gently stroked her daughter's hair. The tears had not stopped since Esther had spoken. Every time she looked at her daughter, at the miracle that had unfolded before her eyes, a new wave of emotion crashed over her. But this time, the tears were different. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of healing. She whispered softly, as though afraid to disturb the sacredness of the moment.
Thank you, God. Thank you for this gift.
She had been praying for years, not knowing what exactly to pray for, but always hoping, always wishing for the return of her daughter's voice. Today, Esther's voice had come back to her, and it was as though the weight that had burdened them both for so long had been lifted. It wasn't just the sound of her words. It was the healing of an emotional wound, the end of a silence that had defined their lives for far too long. Ellen's heart was full, and she felt the presence of the entire community around her. In this church, in this moment, they were more than just individuals. They were a collective, bound together by faith and love. The strength of their shared belief had enveloped her, and she realized that the miracle wasn't just about Esther. It was about all of them, coming together in a moment of shared grace. One by one, the members of the congregation stood, and a soft murmur of prayer began to rise, filling the church with a quiet reverence. People shared stories of their own healing, of miracles they had witnessed in their lives. Small, humble moments where God had revealed his presence in the simplest ways. Some spoke of the loss of a loved one and the unexpected comfort they had found. Others spoke of their own struggles with faith, how they had been unsure if they could go on, but somehow in the quiet of their own hearts, they had found strength. As Esther sat quietly, the cat still nestled in her lap, her mother's hand resting on her shoulder, the church felt alive with the energy of hope. The miracle had happened, but it was only the beginning. The real power of the moment wasn't just in the miracle itself. It was in the way it had brought them all closer to one another and closer to the love and grace of God. And in that moment, the congregation understood, perhaps for the first time, the true nature of faith. It wasn't about waiting for grand, miraculous signs. It was about believing in the small, quiet moments that spoke the loudest. In the weeks following Esther's first words in church, her life began to change in subtle yet powerful ways. At home, the silence that had filled their house for so long started to lift. Esther began speaking more, her words tentative at first but gradually growing in confidence. Her speech, once hesitant and fragmented, started to flow more easily. She spoke about her day, her thoughts, and sometimes her fears, things she had kept bottled up for so long. Ellen couldn't believe the transformation. The girl who had stopped speaking 2 years ago now shared her feelings openly. Their conversations, once dominated by silence and unspoken tension, became more meaningful. Esther began to talk about her father's departure, expressing the grief she had internalized for so long, as well as the small joys that had gone unnoticed during her silence. It was a slow process, but with each word, Ellen felt a deeper connection with her daughter. The therapy sessions, once a struggle, began to show progress. Esther spoke more openly with her therapist, and they started to make strides in her emotional recovery. Ellen marveled at how the simple act of speaking, something many people took for granted, had become a profound step toward healing for Esther. Each small victory filled both mother and daughter with renewed hope. Muffin, the stray cat that had unexpectedly entered their lives, became a constant companion in Esther's journey. The church, moved by the miracle of Esther's recovery, adopted Muffin, naming her in honor of the grace she had brought to the community. The cat, once malnourished and lost, became a symbol of hope and healing for Esther. Esther's bond with Muffin deepened. Each day after school, Esther would spend time with the cat, talking to her as if Muffin understood every word. It wasn't just the comfort the cat provided. It was the way Muffin's quiet presence helped Esther find peace and stability. Muffin became a source of strength for Esther, a reminder that healing often comes in unexpected forms. Esther's healing process was no longer solely about regaining her voice. It was also about learning to trust again and finding a sense of security in the presence of those who cared for her. Muffin, in her own simple way, became a part of that healing. As Esther tended to the cat, she learned the importance of patience, both with herself and others. One sunny morning, Esther and Ellen stood outside the church, the familiar walls a symbol of their journey. Esther held Muffin in her arms, her fingers gently brushing the cat's fur. The community had gathered, and a sense of anticipation filled the air. Esther, now steady in her voice and confident in her place within the community, turned to face the crowd. As she looked out at the familiar faces, Esther smiled softly. It was the first time she truly felt part of something bigger than herself. Her voice, steady and clear, broke the silence.
I'm okay now.
The words, simple yet profound, brought tears to Ellen's eyes. She had watched her daughter struggle for so long, and now finally Esther was speaking again, not just with words but with a newfound strength. The community around them erupted in applause, not out of celebration, but out of deep admiration and understanding. Father Mitchell, with a quiet reverence, stepped forward and offered a prayer. He thanked God for the miracle of Esther's voice and for the faith that had brought everyone together.
Sometimes the smallest miracles, like the quiet presence of a cat, can change everything.
He said, his voice filled with emotion. As the service ended, the community lingered, sharing stories of healing and small miracles in their own lives. Esther's story had inspired them all, reminding them that miracles didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes they arrived quietly in the form of a stray cat, a reclaimed voice, or a supportive community. For Esther and Ellen, their journey was far from over. But with Muffin by their side and the love of their community, they knew they had taken a significant step forward. Their story became a living testament to the power of faith, the importance of healing through connection, and the transformative nature of even the smallest moments. Together, they began giving back to their community, organizing events and support groups for those who felt lost or disconnected. Muffin became a beloved symbol of hope, often curled up in the laps of those who needed comfort the most. In time, Esther and Ellen discovered that the pain of their past had been transformed into a profound purpose: to remind others that no matter how broken they felt, love and connection could rebuild even the most shattered hearts. In the end, their story wasn't just about survival, it was about thriving. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can find its way back in, often through the most unexpected companions and acts of kindness.